Hey everyone, it's patch 3.23 Affliction, and today I want to talk about which Wildwood Ascendancy you might want to consider for Arakali on League Start. What I want to do today is to go over every single one of them and talk about their strengths and weaknesses and how they might apply to Arakali, and at the end give my recommendation of what I think you should pick. So the first one I want to start talking about is going to be the Warden of the Maji. Now, I don't feel like this is going to be a very strong ascendancy for Arakali, simply because I don't think any of the tinctures are going to be worth running over a flask. The biggest draw of this ascendancy is going to be Coated Blade, which is going to allow you to use tinctures in your build. Now, the thing about tinctures is they apply specifically to your weapon, which means you're going to have to attack with your weapon to get any use out of it. Now, we can do that in this build by whirling blading through something. So, for example, we could pick up Coated Blade and run this tincture here for Culling Strike, for example. But overall, I don't think there's going to realistically be anything that's going to be worth enough for us to actually consider running tinctures and giving up a flask slot. Now, flasks in this build are going to be pretty fluid. There aren't any specific flask you really need to run other than a Quicksilver flask and an Armor flask. So we should be able to fit one of these in quite easily if something does look absolutely insane. The only problem here is we have a lot of nodes that we're not going to be able to make use of, such as Enduring Sufficient. We aren't going to really want to give up our flask slots for this, as it's mostly going to be a support tincture rather than something that we're going to be using as a core part of our build. Now, one thing that could make us be interested in this is going to be Nature's Concoction. This makes it so whatever is next to a tincture is going to be 30% stronger and gain flash charges, assuming we have hit with our weapon. Now, the problem with this is the flash charges only happen every time you hit an enemy. It's not a conditional. That means we're going to have to be consistently whirling blading through enemies to get flash charges, which is not going to really work. While the effect is going to at least work for the past 4 seconds, so we don't have two whirling blades as often. The place where I could see this being good and the reason you might want to run this would be for Progenesis, but because we have to consistently run through an enemy to get the charges, we won't really be able to have high uptime on Progenesis on bosses. Now, there is one really nice thing about Warden, and that is Wildwood Blessing, which is going to give us level 20 Bark Skin. This is basically Determination and Grace built together into one aura. But the problem with this is we don't really know if this is going to reserve mana or not. I'm going to assume it's going to have a reservation cost, and if that's the case, then this is not going to be good at all because there's so many mandatory auras this build is going to want to run in a high-end setup. They're just not going to have a space for this. But if Barkskin does end up being free, and if there are going to be decent tinctures, it might not be bad to consider this. Other issue here is that Lesson of the Seasons is just not going to be very good. There's just conditional avoidance of ailments, and we already have ailments immunity through Purity of Elements. And Oath of the Maj is just not going to be something that we're going to be able to really take advantage of because we need all of our gem sockets. It's a build that does not have enough gem sockets to fit everything it wants to. Overall, I don't think Warden's going to be good, but maybe there's a tincture that makes it decent enough to choose, and it could be a potential meme option for later on. Now, moving on to one of the really interesting choices, which I think might see quite a lot of play in Arakali and could potentially be a really strong choice. We have the Warlock of the Mist. So the first thing to mention about this is the whole left side of the tree is going to be completely useless for us. This is going to focus on using the new spell Archmage that is based on your life, and it's going to just completely destroy our whole build because we need to reserve a lot of auras, so we can't even pick up Singumancy without breaking our whole build. So everything interesting on this tree is going to be on the right side. Now, the reason you want to consider this and the first strong thing about this is going to be the ability to choose one of the new curses. The one that we're interested in here is going to be Choir the Damned. Now, there is a curse, Black Mass, which does affect your minions, but unfortunately, this does not work on Arakali at all because it requires you to target damageable minions, and Arakali minions are immune to all damage, which means this will just not apply to them. So Penance Mark is going to be the only real option that we can choose from here. We do have Pacify, which makes an enemy do 0 damage to us as soon as 60% of the curse duration is expired, but personally I feel like it's going to be a little bit too clunky. This build's going to be tanky enough already to where this doesn't matter. So the only choice here really is going to be Penance Mark. What Penance Mark is going to do is it's going to summon enemies from whatever monster is marked with Penance Mark. This means that we'll get a consistent supply of new corpses and kills during a boss fight, which is going to mean that if you have Gravevine, your Arakali minions should consistently be resummoned, which means you won't have to press your Worm Flask more than once. Now, you're still going to need your Worm Flask to start your whole loop, which does not mean this gives us an additional flask slot, but it's going to mean that you don't need to take Rithlasa, so you have consistent flash charge generation, and instead you can just simply run Gurkthul for some physical damage reduction. The other nice thing is going to be Foul Pact. Now, Foul Pact is going to make it so we get 50% increased flash charges from these monsters, meaning you could potentially fit in a Progenesis into this build. Progenesis is one of the most broken ways to stay alive in this game, and it's just one of the strongest defensive layers possible. So with Foul Pact, we could potentially fit in one 24/7 and have 100% uptime on bosses with it, which would be an amazing defensive layer. The only issue here is that Foul Pact and Choir the Damned are just not going to really do much for you in mapping because you're just going to be mapping so fast and you aren't going to really have a way to apply the mark onto enemies without consistently having to stop. This is mostly just going to be a choice for bosses, but it might potentially be an incredibly strong defensive option for bosses with Progenesis. The other potential really interesting thing here that might make all this worth it is going to be Soul Splitting, which gives us level 20 Dark Effigy. Now I'm going to speculate that Dark Effigy is going to be exactly the same thing as the Arc Nemesis Effigy skill, which summons a little totem that is linked to whatever you target, which means if we hit that totem that the target is going to take damage from it. One potentially really broken use case here is going to be with Melee Splash. Typically, you're running Melee Splash in Arakali to spread your poisons a little bit faster from your spiders, which causes your Profane Bloom chains to start a little bit faster. Now, one thing that Arakali used to do a few seasons back before Hydrosphere was nerfed is we used to run Hydrosphere permanently in this build because your minions could Melee Splash off of the Hydrosphere, which would then cause the Viper Strike to also hit the target, effectively giving you double damage and be able to double dip in damage. Dark Effigy could potentially be Hydrosphere coming back to the game, so where we could potentially drop this right on top of the enemy that we're fighting, i.e. a boss, and then the spiders will either attack the effigy and then cleave onto the boss, or the boss and then cleave onto the effigy, which means this could potentially be double damage. That is to say, if the effigy does have 100% damage transfer. Even if it is something like 50% damage transfer, it does mean you just get 50% more damage, meaning this could be an incredibly strong DPS increase. We're going to have to see what this skill is and how it works, but if it does work the way I think it does, and if it is going to allow us to double dip off of it, then Warlock of the Mist will immediately be a very strong option to pick, not only because of the incredible DPS potential of Soul Splitting, but also the potential defense potential of Foul Pact. The last point that we're going to be picking up, because we can't really take Sanguinomancy, would be Blood Hunt, and Blood Hunt would actually be quite nice to have. What Ravenous does is it's going to give you a skill that lets you target a corpse, and you're going to get reduced damage taken from that corpse's type. So for example, if it's a human, you'll take less damage from humanoids. If it's an Eldritch monster, you'll take less damage from Eldritch, which does apply to bosses as well, and you're going to do more damage to them. Now, we don't know if that damage is your damage, which means it would not apply to Arakali, or how this exactly is going to work. But if this has the opportunity to work with minions, which I really hope it does, considering we have Black Mass, which is a minion specific node on here, then this would also be a really strong option for bossing. For mapping, it might be a little bit annoying to have to target a corpse every map to get your bonus going. But if it's going to be a large bonus, something like 10% less damage taken, 10% more damage done, then it'll definitely be worth it to take an extra second at the start of a map and to consume a corpse with it. So overall, Warlock of the Mist has a very strong potential of being really, really good. And we'll have to really see just what Dark Effigy does, as this is the only unknown here. And it's going to be the thing that might push you to take this over any other choice. And lastly, let's talk about the Wildwood Primalist, which I think is going to be the most interesting option here and the one that most people are going to end up picking. The Primalist is very simple. All it has is 3 charm sockets, which is going to allow us to equip a new item called Charms, as well as 2 interesting utility points. The first one being Howl the Wolf, which is a magic find option for your Warcries, which is not going to be relevant to us in any way, and we are not going to give up a charm socket for it. The other one being a little bit of extra inventory space, which I think is really cute. The main draw here is going to be the 3 charm sockets, and these are going to potentially be incredibly overpowered and potentially be build defining for a lot of builds this season. What the charm sockets are going to hold are going to be a new item called Charms, and there are going to be 3 different types of charms. First, we're going to have the Ursine charm, which is going to have ascendancy points from all of the strength related ascendancies. This is going to be Templar, Marauder, and Duelist. Then we have the Lupine charm, which is going to be all of the dex-based ascendancies, so Trickster, Ranger, and Duelist. And lastly, we have the Covine charm, which is going to be the intelligence-based ascendancies, so Templar, Witch, and Trickster. And this is going to give you a random mix of 2 ascendancy points from the ascendancies within each group. If we look here, we have a few really powerful examples, which is why we should be getting excited about this. So as you can see here, we have a charm that effectively gives you Profane Bloom and the good portion of Pious Path. And as you can see here, it's only 14% Profane Bloom and only 2 seconds for the Linger. I'm going to assume these are going to have rolls. I'm going to assume the Profane Bloom is going to be something like 10 to 20% and potentially the Consecrated Ground 2 or 1 seconds all the way to 4. With this, we have some potentially really strong things we could do in this build with the 3 charm sockets that we have available to us. So one of the first really powerful options that I want to talk about is if we can get ranger charms. We've already seen that Nature's Adrenaline is going to be a charm and it's going to be 1 flask per every 3 seconds. So potentially what you could do is you can get 3 charms with the 1 flask per 3 seconds, effectively giving you the same power of Nature's Adrenaline itself. And when it combined with a few medium flask sock cluster jewels, means we should be able to have the flask sustain of Pathfinder, meaning we potentially add a powerful flask such as Progenesis into our build, making us substantially stronger and giving us an insane amount of extra tankiness. Another potential option here would be if Gathering Winds is a charm option. Now, as we saw with the charms, especially if you look back at Pious Path, the only portion of Pious Path we were getting was the bottom portion, the linger effect. We don't know if there potentially could be the other portion of Pious Path as a different role on there, or if it's only going to specifically be choice portions of each of the Ascendancy nodes. But what we're going to hope for here is that for the Tailwind one, we're going to specifically get the you and nearby allies have Tailwind. If that's going to be the case, this is going to be incredibly strong for our Arakali minions. Not only are they going to be substantially faster, but this is going to give them a large amount of attack speed and it's going to make you overall faster, meaning not only is your clear better, but your damage overall is stronger. Another really powerful option for the Lupine one specifically would be pairing it with Trickster's Spellbreaker. The portions that we're interested in here is either the second or the third line, the prevent, suppress spell damage, or the 50% chance for your recharge to start again. What we could do is potentially combine it with the Quartz Infusion, which we're going to hope is just going to be the spell suppression portion of this, meaning we can either stack a lot of Quartz Infusions to get most of the spell suppression done for us. As you can see, our build is kind of top left and eventually be bottom left as well, meaning we're very far away from any of the spell suppression on the tree. So if we can get spell suppression through the Quartz Infusion charms and potentially stack it with the prevent spell suppression damage, or if the spellbreaker portion of Trickster is also more spell suppression cap could realistically happen in this build, and this should allow us to have enough space for something like Gathering Winds. If you want to take a look at the Earth Sign charms, we have one that stands out to me as a very powerful option, and if this is going to be a charm, will probably be added in most builds, and that is Unbreakable. Now, either portion of Unbreakable, if we don't get all of Unbreakable, will be very strong, especially in this build, because we are going to be running a Brass Dome, which is an armor that has a lot of base armor on it. So if we were able to double the armor of Unbreakable, that would give us a lot of extra base armor for Aegis Aurora to give us a lot of recovery. Or if we get the mini Transcendence portion of this, which is arguably the better portion of it, we would get a lot of additional effective health pool, which is going to be very strong, especially if we can stack these. Another powerful option would just be a Velaco, and I'm going to assume this is just going to give you Velaco with no downsides, which would allow us to redo a little bit of our tree to stack a little bit more max fire res, meaning we can hit 90 resistances in this build really easily. The last thing I want to mention here is something to get your mind racing about what we could do with charms are going to be the witch ascendancies themselves. So the reason we're playing Cultist is because Profane Bloom is massively carrying us for clear. What we could potentially do is play as Necromancer. If the Profane Bloom charms are cheap, that means we can pick up Profane Bloom as a charm instead of spending an ungodly amount of money for a Flesh and Flame Profane Bloom. The reason we would want to play Necromancer over a Cultist is because a natural strength is incredibly powerful. If we were to swap everything over to Arakali really quickly, as you can see, a natural strength is just 30% of our damage. And when we combine this with the rest of Necromancer, we have a really strong Ascendancy. One more thing to mention about all this is that we don't really have a way to scale Profane Bloom. And the way we're currently making this actually do a relevant amount of damage for a clear is just through Spiritual Aid, which makes any minion damage just become generic minion damage for us. The thing about Necromancer is there's a lot of generic minion damage on all of these nodes, giving us substantially more damage for Profane Bloom. The final option with all of this as well could potentially be picking up Shaper of Flames. Shaper of Flames would allow us to run Oriaph's End, and this would allow both Profane Bloom and Oriaph's End not only to scale off of Spiritual Aid, but to also then ignite, and then those ignites would scale off of Spiritual Aid, giving us incredibly strong clear, and having the clear this build suddenly competes with the high-end super fast zoomer builds. Charms potentially give us a lot of playing around, and this doesn't go just for this build, but basically every build in the game, as almost all other builds can now consider Profane Bloom and potentially Shaper of Flames or Oriaph's End as a portion of their build. I think this is the correct option for everyone at League Start. That is if we don't get to know what effigy does beforehand. And I will have a follow-up video to this one a few days into the league to discuss ascendancies further and to talk about anything new that we might have learned. I think what you should do with Wildwood Primalist is just to pick up either whatever charms you find as you play through the Wildwood, or to potentially buy anything that seems half decent off of trade until one, we can see just how rare the good charms are, or until two, you can get your hands on them. That's all I really have to say for this video. If you have any other questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. I also stream every day on Twitch, so feel free to come by and ask your questions there or just hang out. And other than that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you cuties in the next video.